네, 지금부터 패널 토론이 진행되겠습니다. We will now begin the panel discussion. Distinguished Professor Moon Jae-in, Special Advisor to the President for the Foreign Affairs and National Security, will serve as the moderator for this panel discussion. 패널 토론의 사회는 문정인 대통령 통일외교안보 특별보좌관님께서 맡아주시겠습니다. Taking part as the panelists are General Colin Powell, former United States Secretary of State, Mr. Kevin Rudd, former Prime Minister of Australia, and Mr. Thomas Pickering, former U.S. Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. 패널 토론자로 콜린 파월 전 미국 국무부 장관님, 케빈 러드 전 호주 총리님, 그리고 토마스 피커링 전 미국 국무부 차관님이 계십니다. 그럼 이제 문정인 교수님께 마이크를 넘기겠습니다. Now I'll hand over the floor to distinguished professor Moon Jae-in.
네, 감사합니다. 그냥 질문에 들어가겠습니다. Secretary Powell, Prime Minister Rudd argued that in the past there was only 5% of possibility of war on the Korean Peninsula. Now he increased it to 25%. Do you agree with his reading?
I have no idea. I don't know where these percentages come from. And so I would ask my distinguished friend and former Prime Minister to explain his math.
Prime Minister Rudd, would you explain, and also would you make a distinction between possibility and probability? Because in your text,
it's called 50%. Yeah, I might have been to a rural Australian primary school, but we didn't have to take off our shoes and socks to count. And I understand why General Powell's not putting numbers on it. I mean, it's just in his domestic political context, and furthermore, given the status he has in the United States, that would not be helpful. But I'm not. I'm actually observing developments around the world and observing various national reactions to the unfolding realities on the Korean Peninsula. And there's one unshakable, unmovable fact, and that is that the North Korean capability can now reach continental United States. Secondly, they intend to perfect that. And thirdly, this represents, though it's never stated as such, a deep red line in the American political culture and foreign policy and security policy culture. And finally, if you want the adducement of evidence, then as I said in my formal remarks, when I go to China in the last short period of time, the Chinese, looking at all these barometers of change, North Korean technical advance, North Korean political and foreign policy posture, the mood of the leader in Pyongyang, together with the mood of the leader in Washington, they put two and two together, and they say that the possibility is increasing, but it's certainly not a probability. But it's enough to give us, I think, a legitimate cause for concern, hence my analogy at the end of the speech about the dangers of sleepwalking.
Ambassador Pickering, what did you take? Even Richard Haas, in fact, in Prime Minister Rudd quoted in Richard Haas, who said that if there's a 50% chance of war outbreak on the Korean Peninsula, do you buy that Richard Haas argument?
Well, I join General Powell in the view that putting a figure on it is just a wild-assed guess. I think I join Prime Minister in the notion that it is almost undeniable that it has increased for the reasons he gave and for the reasons that we all know, that you have two leaders on each side who seemed at the moment to be inevitably avoiding the diplomacy and totally focused on the pressure. And I think we're getting to the point where that could lead to some kind of accidental, miscalculated, misperceived, misjudged potential for conflict. And I will tell you, if that conflict went beyond conventional, it would be, as the Secretary has described it, an unmitigated disaster. And that the experts can all tell you, the New York Times 2 days ago had an article quite devastating on how and in what way a nuclear war could proceed in this region and the United States, and you ought to read it if you haven't. And the one thing that the experts can never tell you is how a nuclear exchange can be ended. It usually is the exhaustion of the weapons capability on the targets that are available. And that, in my view, is not pleasant stuff.
Secretary Powell.
I'd just like to add a word or two. I totally agree with what Tom Pickering just said, but one other thing we should keep in mind. During my time as chairman and for decades before that, I was responsible for watching the missiles of the Soviet Union and where they were and how far away they were. And every morning I would wake up to get briefed on these weapons, and the ones that were in Europe, in the western provinces of the Soviet Union or in one of the satellite states, they would reach Washington in 28 minutes. The submarines were off the coast of Virginia, and their missiles could reach Washington in 12 minutes. And this was, of course, deep concern. But you have to understand that these weapons are so terrible, and the Russians understood it as well as we did. You have to first see, not just suddenly people are shooting missiles at each other. There has to be almost a total collapse of the political environment. And so that's why when we looked at the Soviet Union over all those years, you really had to see a collapse of the political environment before you really could expect that somebody might even think about using these things. And I also believe, to answer the other part of the question, is that once you start, it continues until it's over, until you've made sure that you have totally devastated your enemy. And we had many things that we were going to do where we could put a lot of nuclear weapons on a single target if that's what we thought was necessary. There was also a theory for a while that you could do it at a lower level and have only a theater conflict. I never believed that. Once you start those, it'll go up, and it'll be a total thermonuclear exchange as you fire your missiles so that they can't hit them before they have been used. We never want to see this scenario unfold. So if I look at the peninsula here, I would be keeping my eye closely on, the political situation. And I can never imagine a political, at least not right now, maybe with 5% I could imagine it, a political situation where the United States would feel so threatened by North Korea that we would do preemption. President Trump uses some very extreme language from time to time. But remember, he came into office determined not to get involved in any new conflicts. He's got enough of the old ones still laying around. So even though sometimes he talks rather truculently, I don't think he's anxious. And his America First concept has not been one to get more deeply involved in potential conflicts around the world, but to pull back. And he's demonstrated that, I think, in a way that isn't really not serving our interest.
It's very good news from Secretary Powell. But how about in the Prime Minister Rudd? But the United States has been talking about preemptive strikes or preventive war, okay? But we are really feeling kind of, sense of urgency from the United States. And a lot of, South Koreans would believe that, the United States would take such a kind of bold military move against North Korea. What is your view on that?
Well, the bottom line is, with great respect to my American friends and colleagues, both of whom I know reasonably well, and I recognize their historical contribution to US foreign policy in Asia, Tom would not be referring us to a New York Times article on how a nuclear war could unfold if there wasn't something to it which triggers his attention and concern. And that to me suggests that we therefore are facing a heightened possibility. When Colin in his remarks before, in his formal remarks, spent some time elaborating on the real consequences of nuclear devastation, I would assume that part of his intention is to make sure that that is read carefully in Washington. So all I'm pointing to is the fact that we are looking at a set of circumstances which are now more possible against the possibility of a US unilateral military action of some form or another, and I use those terms very advisedly, than before. This is not a negligible concern. That's why we're here. That's why we're having this discussion. We are alert to that. Otherwise, we'd all just go home because we think it would never happen. So therefore, I push back against my American friends and their well-meaning assault on my mathematical capabilities. And as I said, though I went to one of the poorest schools in rural Queensland, we were taught how to count, and at high school we even did some calculus. But doomsdayism doesn't help. But I finish on this. When I read Christopher Clark's quite thorough history of the diplomatic communications between Berlin, Paris, London, and Vienna, and Serbia in the lead up to the First World War. If you look at this carefully, there was a sense that war was such an horrific possibility in terms of its likely consequences for the great powers, it would never happen. And in that environment, people did sleepwalk to a particular set of actions which had unintended consequences until it was too late. My very final muttering will be this. I was speaking to a Chinese friend within the last month. He's from the foreign policy establishment. He just reminded me afresh that crises have their own logic. And as the General knows better than all of us, war has its own logic, but crises have their own logic as well. What's the best thing to do then? Avoid ever getting into a crisis.
Ambassador Pickering?
This question is important but not seminal. The seminal question is, what do we do about DPRK nuclearization? And the uncertainties that brings we can argue about. But Secretary Powell would not have given us his brilliant ideas on the dangers of nuclear weapons if he himself didn't feel that that was a useful message to get across. And I take that even against the reassurances that there is logic and there is rationale. We have had circumstances not having to do with decisions but accidents in terms of miscalculating incoming signals on radar. On a number of occasions, we know about those because they've been published. They are of the same variety. We also know that the Cuban Missile Crisis and our examination of it required a serious determination to make more stable the deterrent as long as we needed to live with it. And that's very important. We now have a North Korea and a problem in the region that has horrendous ramifications. There is no way, I believe, we can proceed by sitting back and falling back on pure deterrence. And I thought the Prime Minister gave us a brilliant exposition of all the problems we would face, and the notion, in fact, that optimistic diplomats had to re-examine their optimism, and I have done that. And I used to believe in the Middle East there were only two kinds of American diplomats, optimists and lunatics. And I still believe, with respect to East Asia, that little aphorism may have some truth to it as well. But that we have to find a way to begin, and that at some point very soon, diplomacy has to begin to pick up the slack that has to be used to help to shape the answer or tell us we haven't found it yet. But it is extremely important we explore that particular set of possibilities, whether it's freeze for freeze or cessation of the production of fissile material or confidence-building measures. Trust is the essence of the absence of this particular issue. Neither side trusts the other. And clearly, I join here with our friends in South Korea. How could you possibly trust the other side? Well, in the end, to make a deal, unfortunately, trust has to come. And it has to come not out of words, but out of performance.
Now here, as to because now we are Koreans are extremely concerned about the potential conflict escalation on the Korean Peninsula. We really don't think that the U.S. would use a military action against North Korea. And our President Moon Jae-in made it very clear, okay? We do not want another war on the Korean Peninsula, and no one can take a military action without prior consultation and agreement of South Korean government. But the whole issue at stake is the issue of a compellence, show force. This compellence strategy can trigger accidental clashes among parties concerned. What did you take on that one? Do you think the compellence is an important part of diplomacy on the part of the United States?
I think you have to have strong military forces if that's what you're talking about. I'm quite sure the North Koreans are very well aware of what we are capable of doing to them, either through preemption or after they have struck. They know the consequences of their striking the United States or any of our allies. Now, our allies would always be wondering, would the Americans actually do this? In this case, we have treaty obligations with South Korea, with Japan, with others in the region, to include Australia. And I'm confident, but I'm not the president. I'm just a former general. No, I'm a former secretary, not a former general. I'm still a general. But I'm confident, based on my experience in this business, is that if such a thing was necessary, the United States would do it. And you have to remember that we know what we can do to North Korea. And North Korea is not sure what it could do with a few missiles. I come back to my original point in my presentation. I don't know what strategic objective they think would be achieved by blowing up a corner of an American city if it results in their destruction the next day, total destruction. I don't know why they would come to such conclusions. So I have to go back to the point I made earlier that I think they have done it mostly to deter us, as opposed to have an actual warfighting capability against the United States of America by being able to attack one of our cities. You know, China, from these many years, the last 40 years, have had nuclear weapons. They have never done much to expand their nuclear weapons program. They just have enough to make sure that they can deter any attack against them. And to some extent, that is what I think the North Koreans are doing. But, as Kevin would remind me, pity if we're wrong. So anticipate that you might be wrong and make sure you remain strong militarily, so you can do what you're planning to do. But more importantly, get the diplomacy going, even though it is hard, even though it's difficult. That has to be the solution. We don't want to take any risk if we can avoid it, but risk is a part of life.
Yes, please go ahead. Yeah.
Got it. The point of my referencing 25% has the single objective of what both Tom and Colin are talking about, which is to compel us in the direction of diplomacy. This is not an exercise in determinism. This is an exercise in what then shall we do, and that is the matter for core diplomacy. The second point I'd make is to agree with Colin. This mob in Pyongyang have no interest in nuclear warfighting, none whatsoever, because that is regime suicide. So therefore, our analysis is, therefore, why do they want this? I think there are two reasons. I alluded to them in my remarks before. One is what Colin said, which is their conclusion about long-term regime survival. And remember, this program has been underway for 20 years or so. And number two, which is the more interesting rationale, it's got nothing to do with fighting a nuclear war, is the leverage that gives them in the future against the South and against Japan. I think we need to be clear-minded about that. My third point is, let's go to Tom's challenge of, therefore, what is the diplomacy? This leads us in a couple of directions. Is there a diplomatic channel? And I'd say there is. Plainly, Feltman would not be in Pyongyang if the UN, with the support of various P5 states, was not engaged. Secondly, the Russians wouldn't be engaged in Pyongyang if they thought it was a dead letter. And thirdly, I mean, we're not naive in this room. There are also indirect levels of contact between the United States and North Korea as well, indirect. So these things are alive. What I was seeking to draw attention to in my formal remarks is, where do we then go in the content of the diplomacy? You can have an eternal debate about the process of diplomacy, which we had with the six-party talks, which doesn't produce a landing point. What about the content? So let's go to that question. And that's where I'd very much benefit from the wisdom of colleagues here who are more experienced in this domain than I am. One is, from an American perspective, would you see the, let's call it the ICBM freeze, as a possible way through? Second, are there other elements of freeze which are worth considering? And thirdly, for those of us who from time to time have looked at longer-term variants of the grand bargain, which is where do you go to in dealing with the deep psychology of this regime and its future, is that credible? So, I mean, I think let's use this opportunity to dig into those.
Ambassador Pickering, really, Prime Minister Rudd's idea of so-called grand bargaining, okay, having a peace treaty in return for denuclearization of North Korea. diplomatic normalization between Washington and Pyongyang, okay, and security guarantee or regime guarantee by all parties concerned, and economic reconstruction of North Korea. If those conditions are being met, I think North Korea may give up its nuclear weapons. And then why? Then I will ask first, Prime Minister Rudd, why China should present that conditions to North Korea? Why not the United States directly?
Well, look, it's
Ambassador Pickering, and then
It's an important and challenging question. My own view with a grand bargain is denuclearization has to come before reunification. We all understand that. That means a grand bargain in the nuclear area. My own view is that a grand bargain in the nuclear area takes too much trust, too much confidence, too much building, and leaves too much uncertain in the short term, that if you undertake it, you are going to, in fact, choke the horse rather than solve the problem. And so I think step by step or stage by stage is probably, at least in the present conditions of deep uncertainty, a better way of proceeding. You want to focus that on technical limitations on their nuclear program which have some potential significance in numbers of weapons, in capacity to deliver, in capacity to miniaturize. We're not 100% sure of that. We do know that China has been an advocate of that point of view, and some of us have heard something like that point of view in our Track 2 conversations from time to time. That's no secret. Now, whether that has a real possibility or not, we won't know until we're prepared to try it. But I think that that is something that we have to look at in terms of what's on the table. Now, it is important, just one final piece, that this preserve and strengthen the commitment we have made to both the Republic of Korea and to Japan, because we are not, even with an ICBM freeze, certainly going to solve all the problems. And we know that it is absolutely essential, particularly if we turn to things like exercises, the results of which I think we can produce by other actions, but which are seemingly important to the North in this situation, that we not allow the freeze for freeze, fundamentally to undermine the relationship we have, in large measure because a second but important DPRK effort is to drive wedges between us and the Republic of Korea, and use that eventually for long-term reunification, as the Prime Minister said, on their terms. And we need to be very careful to do that. And I think our relationship can sustain that. And I believe it is important because whatever we do in the short term will not eliminate the problem. It will only begin the process of moving in that direction. But I can't tell you I know something any better. And if the only alternative is war by nuclear destruction, then we ought to exhaust all diplomacy possibilities on that basis alone.
Prime Minister?
Where I fundamentally agree with Tom is on the core proposition of how you structure diplomacy. And in my view, in rare examples, there are rare examples in history where a total deal is struck in one fell swoop. It doesn't happen that way. It goes to the essential dynamics of what diplomacy is as opposed to military action. Diplomacy relies on trust in getting to the table and in trusting your interlocutor that they will honour that which they've committed to once you have left the table. Military action, instead of trust, uses force. I will force you to the table, eventually, and watch out what happens then. So therefore, let's be clear about that. I'm always taken by the wisdom of Deng Xiaoping in China. As I said, I'm a sinologist by training at university. So I've read a lot of what he's had to say about his approach to politics in general and international policy. He's got this great saying in Chinese, which is 摸着石头过河, which is you cross the river by feeling the stones with your feet, one stone at a time. I think there's a bit of wisdom in this when we deal with the complexities of North Korea. And that's a very learned way of saying let's proceed step by step from small steps to big steps. So therefore, let's go to deconstructing various elements of freeze and what can be delivered in response to that to bring about trust on the part of the North Koreans. That, I think, is where our discussion should focus here, from the smaller freeze proposals to the larger freeze proposals. And then you get to what I describe as the much larger geopolitical trust exercise, which is what I've written about in various publications about formations of a grand bargain. That comes at the end of the process, not at the beginning. But here's my concluding thought, and the reason I dwelt on it at some length in my formal remarks is I do worry about the impact in the shorter term of simply buying an ICBM freeze, because I am deeply concerned about decoupling. As a friend of the ROK and as someone from a country who was militarily involved in the War of 50 and 53, and as a fellow ally of the United States, I worry about where the dynamics of that sort of freeze goes, given that short-range missiles and medium-range missiles are quite capable of reaching across the parallel and certainly across the sea to Japan. And so my caveat that I simply would invite comments from my friends about is, when we're looking at freeze, I have a level of anxiety in my guts about ICBM-only freezes.
So Secretary Powell.
I have the same anxiety. One thing I'm pretty sure of, the North Koreans will not agree to anything or enter into any kind of freeze or you do this and we'll do that until they have a capability that they have proven and they feel that they have some safety behind their nuclear deterrence. They're not there yet. My experience in the six-party framework in dealing with them is that they can almost never be trusted for anything. They don't see trust as something that they have to abide by. In fact, they're famous for getting you into a negotiation and promising you one thing, and meanwhile, while you're not looking, they have violated that trust and they're doing something else. And Tom has been through this, and I've been through it. That's just the way North Koreans are. You can go back to read some of the books from the armistice negotiations of 1950 to 53, and there's some brilliant examples of why you don't trust the North Koreans and don't expect that the North Koreans can be trusted. You've got to have some method of forcing trust so that they can't escape from the commitments they have made.
No, Prime Minister Rudd raised a very important question of decoupling, the so-called delinking American security from South Korean security. Therefore, for example, Dr. Kissinger was mentioning that China handled North Korea, then U.S. will take out American forces from South Korea.
Yeah.
Okay? Or another argument is if North Korea verifiably dismantle and verifiably and irreversibly dismantle ICBMs, we will withdraw American troops from South Korea. What did you take on all this decoupling discourse in Washington, D.C.?
I cannot speak for the United States government, but I can tell you right now, as long as the South Korean people want American forces here as part of their security arrangements, American forces will be here.
How about Ambassador Pickering?
Well, I would just add that I'm happy to hear Secretary Powell say it, and I agree. And I think it is the important commitment that we make. There are another couple 100,000 Americans here who can leave when they choose. But the fact that they may be here at any one time, should in fact the threat come because of decoupling, that's another reason both for our forces to be here, but also for our friends in South Korea to know that we have enough confidence to stay here with them on the basis of where we're going. I think that the question of how and in what way we deal with North Korea and any agreement we might make, the Secretary is totally right. He and I know that his boss once said in not wonderful Russian, trust but verify. And I would take this a step further. I would say distrust and verify twice.
There can be no negotiation. If you distrust from the beginning, right, And then what way can you assure in the verification?
Because you can work out ways to have the assurance you need in two fashions. One, through overt inspection, monitoring, and control. And the second is to back it up with your own intelligence capability, which is what we have done with Iran, what we have done and the Soviet Union with us in our course of our disarmament arrangements with the Soviet Union. And the other factor that's very important is they know the failure of these arrangements could bring catastrophic consequences. So there is built into the structure of this a set of uncertainties that works in our favor and not against us, if I could put it that way.
Yes.
I don't have much to add to that because it's been stated elegantly by Tom. But there's one possible addendum, and that is if such an agreement on an element of, let's call it verifiable freeze, was to occur, then ensure that our Chinese friends sign on the bottom line as well, which actually causes us to have, shall we say, a double reaction clause if verification means, either by national intelligence means or by the IAEA, indicates that once again our North Korean friends are cheating, for which they have, shall we say, a long and ignoble history.
Mm-hmm. And just let me add, that's critical that this, however it is done, be done in several ways, but the six-party forum has to be partners to this issue. And they have to be partners going in to get the result as well as coming out on the commitment. And then I think it is wise to take this to the Security Council. After all, the key parties in the Security Council will be part of the six-party framework. And the Security Council is another way of assuring to the North Koreans that it isn't just the US or it isn't just South Korea in this deal. It is the international community that is in one way or another committed behind it. And that in itself will have consequences for them were they to break the deal, no question at all, that they would immediately alienate a very large share of the international community.
By the way, three of you never mentioned about the South Korea's role. Our government has proclaimed that we'll take a leading and proactive role, but none of you have mentioned of that role. What kind of role we can play? Secretary Powell.
The six-party framework, which was created during my watch. The reason there was a six-party framework is because we didn't want anybody to think that the United States was simply doing a bilateral deal with DPRK, and that your equity would be represented, the Japanese and the Russians and Chinese. It could have been a 10-party framework, but we left it at 6 to make it manageable. And we kept our allies not in the 6 informed about what we were doing.
It's amazing because everybody's telling us that the six-party talk is dead, but you are saying that it's still,
Well, it's been moribund for a while.
But the central thesis that I would add to this is we should do nothing in the six-party that we and the Republic of Korea don't have complete agreement on.
Of course.
And we should use the six-party arrangements also to begin to open the door to China. China is not going to give us the deal fully done in our laps. But I do see some possibility of working with China on an outcome, if we can get agreement on it, in terms of the fact that they have to make a contribution to get there. They are necessary but not fully sufficient, I think, in any work here. And so it has to be, in a sense, forums within forums. And it would be a mistake for the U.S. not to talk directly to the DPRK, as long as, in fact, that was done with the full knowledge and understanding of its allies.
Prime Minister, how about the South Korea having direct talks with North Korea? Of course, within the framework of six-party talk, even apart from the nuclear issue, South Korea can engage with North Korea. What is your take? Of course, the United States and Japan think it is now premature. What is your take on that?
I think the first thing is to add one thought to what Colin said before as to why none of us up here in this forum are making public pronouncements about what the government of the ROK should do and not do is because we're both reasonably experienced in these fields. You don't arrive in someone's territory and say, listen, you bunch of dummies, you should be doing this. That's not my style, and I'm sure it's not their style as well. Because President Moon is the democratically elected president of this country, he has a professional apparatus, including Foreign Minister Kang, and they make their own intelligent decisions going forward. Secondly, on your most specific question about inter-Korean dialogue on this question, that's certainly President Moon's position, and I would personally have no problem with it. But my third point is this, and again I build on comments made just before by Tom, which I think are very wise, and it's part of, shall we say, understanding the diplomatic process as simple, just as we understand the evolving content of that diplomacy. And that is, one, bilaterals between the ROK and the DPRK is fine. Bilaterals between the US and the DPRK are fine. Secondly, however, so long as that translates into a formula which is then immediately capable of being put into the six-party talks. Because remember, our Russian friends are in the six-party talks as well. And the six-party talks is not dead. In diplomacy, there's a difference between comatose, dead, and rigor mortis, okay? I think we're comatose. Nothing wrong with being comatose, as long as you've been brought out of the coma. But there's a core reason for this, which is not just legitimization through the involvement of, let's call it the core powers related to this, and I think your initial selection, Colin, was dead right. But secondly, as I said before, having everyone's signature on the bottom line is critical in terms of if and when the North Koreans think they can cheat. And the final stage of the diplomatic process, again, is what Tom referred to before, is that you need to take out the grand chop of the UN Security Council and whack it on the top. That, I think, is the way forward. But it must, in terms of process, but going back to content again, it is the evolutionary nature of freeze of one component or another, building a level of verifiable trust, then going on to destruction of given sets of capabilities over time with verifiable trust. And then thirdly, in terms of grand bargainism, the box of rewards which then exist for the North Koreans, but only in a verifiable way.
Could I just add one small point to the Prime Minister's list of death symptoms? I would rather think before comatose is on vacation. And I think we're closer to on vacation than we are to comatose at the moment.
But in the
Whenever
Secretary
I go
Powell,
on holiday, I'm always comatose.
what do you think about this? Talking is one thing, and recognizing or accepting North Korean nuclear weapon state is another. But the United States doesn't seem to be willing to talk with North Korea.
We have been reluctant. I can't speak for the last several administrations because I wasn't in those administrations, but there has been great reluctance for us to get in direct talks with North Korea because North Korea wants to do this as a way of freezing South Korea out of these talks. And so that's one reason we created six-party framework. And China was perhaps the most active member of that six-party. Most of the meetings were in China. And so what we have tried to do in my time and what I've seen subsequently is let DPRK know they are not going to isolate the United States in a one-to-one conversation. Let's not build these people up so high because they might have a nuclear capability. We've lived with other nations that have had nuclear capability. This is a broken country. This is a poor country. And we have to deal with it, and I think it can be dealt with diplomatically, but it's going to be some tough negotiations. And maybe it's through the six-party framework or some other plan of the kind that
Prime Minister Rudd, do you agree with him?
Yeah, I do. And I'll add one thing to what Colin just said. Again, having just been in Beijing, it reminds me of multiple conversations over the last several years about Chinese collective institutional and political remorse about the vacation which the six-party talks have gone on, whether it's a comatose vacation or not. Because this was one of the first exercises in, let's call it, China's participation actively in a diplomatic initiative. Remember the Deng Xiaoping axiom, hide your strength, bide your time, never take the lead? Well, this was one of the first, shall I say, breakouts from the doctrine. And so there is a deep sense of institutional ownership of the six-party talks in Beijing. Now, My second point is, given what I referred to earlier as the deep conservatism of the Chinese general strategic culture about doing anything radical, because if you look at Xunzi's Art of War, it is a deeply conservative document, which is don't take any risks. The first line of the Art of War says, when it comes to making war, this is a grave matter of state. If you lose, that's the end of the state. That's a pretty interesting opening phrase. It tends to grab your attention. And so I think, given the deep conservatism of Chinese strategic culture, latching on the whatever bilaterals might occur between the ROK in the north and between the United States and the north, formally or informally, then anchoring that into six-party is not only useful and important in terms of legitimization and enforcement, but also, I think, is more probable in terms of China, given its historical, diplomatic and political attachment to the six-party talks formula.
Ambassador Pickering?
I think that Secretary Powell's concerns are real, but they can be dealt with. We had some of the same problems in talking with Iran. And indeed, while the bilateral work proceeded very rapidly, it was accepted by the other negotiating parties, not without some friction, but it happened. And I think that the practice should be, particularly with the Republic of Korea, that they know before we are talking what we're going to talk about, and they know after we talked what we have talked about, so that in fact we can help build the solidity of our mutual trust and indeed our cooperation. And to me, that's an advantage, not a disadvantage, and that certainly should extend in the other direction to whatever it is that President Moon would like to do in his own context. That we need to be sure, in fact, that we stay on the same sheet of music and that we have common agreement on that, because in fact, what they're looking at is wedge driving, and what we're looking at is pressure building. And I think the two have to be looked at very clearly and be done very well. But I don't think that there is a diplomatic process that can't help us rather than one that argues totally against us.
The six-party talks were structured that way. The U.S. was really the lead, and we always shared with our colleagues, especially Japan and South Korea, what we were going to present. And everybody's waiting to hear what we wanted to do. And then we made it look like this is what we all wanted to do. That's the way it has to work.
Prime Minister Rudd, now United Nations has at last, step in the North Korean issue. Is it good, bad? And would we be complementary with the six-party talk processes or not?
Well, those of us who are not great powers or superpowers always put a degree of trust in the United Nations or a degree of credibility in the United Nations. These guys always assume they can look after themselves. The rest of us actually think we need international institutions as well, because these guys will always have slightly different interests, even if they're allies.
I beg your pardon, sir.
Born of 35 years of foreign policy experience, Colin, and you would do the same. And read the history of the formation of the United Nations. It's kind of an interesting exercise in, shall we say, US-led diplomacy as well. Mm-hmm. But number one, whatever the weaknesses of the United Nations are, and we could have a full-day seminar on that, the truth is it's the only source of uncontestable international legitimacy. So therefore, whatever is done in the final analysis, as we've said already in this discussion, should find its way to the UN Security Council. Two, that is why I think it's a very positive step that someone like Jeff Feltman has been enjoying the delights of Pyongyang in the last 3 days. I'm sure he's done the Pyongyang by night tour, which I've done before as well, and he discovered that there are very few lights in Pyongyang at night. But I go back to the simple point that it was not a small thing which happened in the early 90s when both the South and the North became members of the United Nations. It's not a small thing that occurred. And therefore, in the minds of the DPRK leadership, despite their complaints about a series of UN Security Council resolutions which are hostile to their perceived interests, they are not members of the United Nations for nothing. So therefore, having a UN Special Envoy, or however Mr. Feltman's visit has been described, is positive. Positive in socialising the rest of the North Korean apparatus to the fact that this institution, which they sought desperately to join when Kim Il-sung was still alive, is still around and still provides a vehicle for legitimacy in terms of final outcomes to be achieved. My only criticism of the UN is that they should have had special envoys in there much earlier. And in fact, as this problem with the North evolved over not just the last 6 months, but over the last 5 to 10 years.
Okay, now final words. We can start with Ambassador Pickering. Final words to the Korean people.
Well, the final word, I think, is what I would sum up as the key points that we've discussed. That there is an increased danger without mathematical precision. That has raised the question of what to do about it. What to do about it, I think, quite clearly, is to try to open a careful diplomatic effort, and that we've talked both about how to do that in terms of format, which is easy, and how to do that with respect to substance is harder, but I don't think we have bumped up against an insuperable barrier in how to start. And we don't know how to end, but in the end, I think we must be clearly working toward denuclearization, as impossible and as hard as that may seem. We may not get there, but we may get some things that will improve stability, will improve the capacity to deter, as long as we have to have a deterrent. And I think those are helpful and useful. And I think finally, no war without exhausting other possibilities is pretty much a watchword we ought to be very good about.
Prime Minister Rudd.
Having been reprimanded by my 2 American friends and colleagues about 25%, I will now adjust my probability down to 24%. I think this is an appropriate, respectful response to our common ally. Anyway, as Tom just said, something's happening out there and it's getting worse, and I think we're all a bit more worried about it. My point is simply this. Channels we've spoken about. Sorry. One, diplomacy we've spoken about, it's essential. It's unfashionable, but it's essential. It's watching paint dry, it's watching grass grow, but frankly, those of us who have been engaged in the business in various forms over time know that ultimately, and often mysteriously, suddenly the game moves, so long as you're there at the table and so long as there is a table. Point 2, on the question of the content of where the process of, let's call, an evolving set of agreements may go, if I had one piece of advice to all parties, it would be ensure that on the table there is something which materially affects not just the interests of the United States, but which materially affects the interests of the ROK and Japan. What does that mean in practice? That what's on the initial slate should obviously deal with the ICBM question, but it also should deal with future accumulation of fissile material, given that it's nuclear bombs, which can be delivered short, medium, and long term, and by, shall we say, other mechanisms. By doing that and ensuring that you have, shall I say, at the first stage of the diplomatic process, those elements on the table, they go to the interests of both the United States and the South Koreans and the Japanese, and therefore you avoid decoupling.
Secretary Powell.
I'd first just like to say something that I have said throughout my career in the military and in State Department, and that is the people of South Korea can always be assured of the friendship and support they will receive from the United States of America. We are treaty allies, but also we fought to bring this country into safety in 1950 to 53, and we have watched and supported it throughout all of the intervening years. And we are the closest of friends and will remain that for the future, there's no doubt in my mind. With respect to the DPRK, I want this nuclear program to be stopped. I think it has to be stopped through diplomatic means of any form that Mr. Rudd or Tom Pickering spoke about. Whatever works, let's get it going. And America should not be resistant or reluctant to this kind of approach. North Korea may well develop a full capability to deliver such a weapon. The intelligence communities think they're close. I'm not sure how close they are. But I also know that if it is used, it is not going to be a war. It's going to be a terrorist attack, because there's nothing to gain from this other than terror. And the terror attack will be dealt with immediately. And the war, if you want to call it that, will be over rather quickly. And we got to make sure that the North Koreans understand this, and that our allies in the region and in the world understand it as well. We need to stop thinking that a nuclear weapon is just another form of artillery. It is not. It is an existential weapon that crosses all barriers, that will result in destruction of a nature that we haven't seen in microcosm since August of 1945. And that is why I support all of the movements that are taking place around the world now to reduce nuclear weapons to that happy day, maybe many, many years in the future, when they're no longer needed and they are gone.
I think it was really exciting, panel discussion. We can clearly see that the message of guarded optimism, and it is very nice to hear what this distinguished, expert was telling us. First, denuclearization of Korean Peninsula is a must. It's a mandate. It's a historical mandate. And second, what can be avoided? Okay? It's not our destiny. And third, diplomatic and peaceful resolution of North Korean nuclear problem is more than doable. Then it is a function of, to what extent we work hard to come up with innovative ideas. And apparently, Prime Minister Rudd has given very interesting and ambitious proposals of grand bargaining. Okay. And also, one thing very clear is this, really assuring is this, that people are talking about decoupling, but it won't happen. Okay. And finally, multilateral approach is still viable and desirable. And six-party talk is not dead. United Nations can play a very constructive role in resolving North Korean nuclear issue. All these issues are very inspiring and encouraging words. Let us give a big applause to the panelists.
Thank you for the passionate and inspirational discussion. Once again, please give a big round of applause to our moderator and our panelists. 열정적이고 심도 있는 토론 감사드립니다.